Fennell's new adaptation of Wuthering Heights, titled Wuthering Heights, and starring Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie, has been causing a lot of chatter lately. And I'm an expert in chatter, so I thought I'd contribute my own to the conversation. Emerald Fennell has been pretty open about the fact that her goal was not to make a faithful adaptation of the book. Instead, her goal was to capture what it felt like for her to read this book for the very first time at 14 years old. So you can imagine that what she ended up with was not a faithful adaptation of the book, because that wasn't what she was trying to do. And this has sparked a fascinating conversation, one that we began on this channel when talking about Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, which is what constitutes a film adaptation of the book, and at what point have you distorted the source material to the point where you cannot claim it's an adaptation anymore? And is it fair to criticize these works on that if the creators are open about the fact that they weren't really attempting to be faithful to begin with? But in order to have this conversation as adeptly as we could, I did have to read the source material, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, which I really enjoyed, and I made a whole video about where I talked about it in depth that I do consider to be a part 1 of this video. I will try to make what I'm saying make sense even if you haven't seen that first video. But if you reach a point in this video where I say something about the book and you think to yourself, back that up a little bit more with evidence from the text, I probably did do that in part 1. So I know people probably won't listen to me, but I would just ask that you go and watch that before you comment and tell me I'm wrong about the book. But in this video, we are going to be focused on talking about Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights. I love doing that. That actually is a really fun way to say a movie title. Wuthering Heights. So because I had never read Wuthering Heights before going into making these videos, I was introduced with a really unique opportunity to not finish the book before I went to see the film, so I actually was completely missing the context of the source material. So that's what I did. Now, I've already told you in our intro that the thesis of this video is discussing at length whether or not you can defend this film by saying that the creator has said that it wasn't their goal to make a faithful adaptation, so we can't criticize it for not being a faithful adaptation, yada, yada, yada. But I think the whole conversation surrounding this film is really fascinating. And so I'll show you my hand and tell you that I don't really think that that's a fair defense of this film. I don't think you can remove it from the context of its source material, but I will make that argument over the course of this video. But I thought it would be kind of a fun exercise to talk about the film completely devoid of any other context on its own and then introduce that conversation in afterwards. So don't comment and be like, but you can't separate from... I agree. So let's walk through the plot of the film and let's talk about how I felt about it, just completely separate from the original book. Full spoilers. This film opens on a blank screen where you can hear the audio of a man grunting and some wood creaking. The audio paints a pretty vivid picture on its own, and you expect to be watching a couple having sex. But instead, when the visuals come on screen, what you actually see is a man being hanged. There isn't really like a delicate way for me to put the fact that the man being hanged also has an erection, and that's kind of an important part of the scene and the whole imagery of all of it. The film and then subsequently this video are not going to be for people who are uncomfortable talking about that kind of stuff, so just a heads up on that as well. But don't worry, just in case you missed the visual of this happening, some boys in the crowd very delicately put it by going, "Oh look, he's got a stiffy," which I actually do really appreciate because that is what all British people sound like to me all the time. So now I just have a really good reference for like what the British accent sounds like to me. A young Catherine Earnshaw and her paid companion Nellie are in the crowd and they find this to be very funny. And after the hanging, we watch them run through the moors back to the estate Wuthering Heights with the opening song to the album that Charlie XCX wrote to go along with this film playing in the background, the one that's gone viral on TikTok that's like, "I think I'm gonna die in this house." Anyway, I thought this opening was actually really cool. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, I wonder if this film actually is gonna have a more similar tone to the book, because I actually couldn't think of anything more Wuthering Heights feeling than thinking you're gonna watch a sex scene, but instead it's a man dying. There is something very reminiscent of the tone of the original novel in that for me watching it, and I thought it was a really cool opening. And I was sad. I was like, okay, Emerald Fennell, show me what you got. We then see Mr. Earnshaw, Kathy's father, witness a young boy being mistreated by his father, or implied to be his father. I guess we don't know for sure. But Mr. Earnshaw steps in to try and help the boy, and as a result of this interaction ends up taking the boy and taking him back to Wuthering Heights, where he doesn't tell his name to everybody, and it's implied that this is because he can't speak, but then he talks in like the scene right after, so that was a little bit weird. But Kathy is the one who names him Heathcliff after her dead brother. And then we get a few scenes with a young Kathy and a young Heathcliff. We watch them interact, we watch them bond. I just have to say, both of these child actors are incredible, and I actually thought that they had way more chemistry with each other, and it was a lot more believable to me that they were childhood best friends and lifelong love interests than when it came to the adult Kathy and Heathcliff, unfortunately. But these kids rocked it. They did a really, really good job. The young scenes with them end with Mr. Earnshaw starting to show some early signs of alcoholism. Really, he's been showing that throughout this whole opening. But one drunk night, he's really upset at Kathy and Heathcliff being late to his birthday dinner. And so even though it's Kathy's fault that they were late, Heathcliff takes the blame, and Mr. Earnshaw beats him as a result. And there's a scene with young Kathy and young Heathcliff afterwards where Kathy is really apologetic for this, and Heathcliff says that he would always take something like that on her behalf so that she doesn't have to experience it. And then we get a giant time skip to adult Kathy and adult Heathcliff, who are played by Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi respectively. That would be kind of funny if they flipped that. I actually would have loved that choice. So this time skip happens, and we see that Wuthering Heights has really fallen into disrepair. And we see as an adult Kathy, who we don't know exactly how old she is, but at some point we are told that she is well past spinster age, finds out that a new neighbor is moving in by the name of Edgar Linton, and lets the servant Heathcliff know that she views this as their opportunity to get a better life, and that her plan is to marry Edgar so that he can financially provide for them. But a jealous Heathcliff does not love this idea. However, Kathy expects that the Lintons are going to call upon the Earnshaws to meet them, and after a bit, when they haven't, she approaches the manor to spy on them a little bit, and witnesses Edgar and his ward, Isabella, not his sister, his ward, describing the plot of the ending of Romeo and Juliet in painstaking detail to Edgar. And I felt really called out by this scene. I think this was actually kind of rude and disrespectful of Emerald Fennell because it felt like a direct call out of me specifically. And the whole time that I was editing my first video where I was going so in depth about the book plot, I just kept thinking about that scene. I am Isabella. But anyway, Kathy is eavesdropping on this conversation and accidentally falls off of the wall. It's unclear if she actually hurt herself or was just pretending to be injured, but she ends up staying at Thurcross Grange, which is the estate that Edgar and Isabella live at, 4 or 5 weeks for her ankle to heal, and by the time she returns back to Wuthering Heights, not only does she have a whole new wardrobe and now is coming across as a total lady, but she and Edgar are engaged. Obviously, Heathcliff does not love this, and he storms off, and he's kind of standoffish towards Kathy after this. He lives in an attic above the horse stable, so she goes to his attic to try and discuss this with him, to talk it out. And while she's up there, 2 servants, Zillah and Joseph, steal into the stable below to have a little bit of a tryst together. And not only is it scandalous that they're having this adult moment together, but the way in which they're doing it. And they use some of the stable equipment to create a bit of a ye olde BDSM situation. But we don't really see this play out super in depth. We see flashes of it so that the viewer gets an understanding of what's happening. But really most of the scene is focused in on Kathy's face as she's watching this and listening to the sounds of what's happening below. And at some point a hand clamps over her mouth, and you know it's Heathcliff's, right? So he covers her mouth and then he covers her eyes, which is kind of cute and funny, but also a little saucy. It's also worth noting that Heathcliff and Kathy are physically in a similar position to Zillah and Joseph in the stable below, which in the year of our Lord 2026 we would call doggy style. And we just listened to the audio of Joseph and Zillah finishing their activities, but on this close-up of Kathy's face as she's kind of sitting in the same position with Heathcliff. And in the immediate aftermath, Kathy is so flustered by this whole thing that she just runs off, and we get a full view of Heathcliff, where Emerald Fennell ensures that we see that he really liked this whole thing. And honestly, I did too. No notes. notes. Again, Emerald Fennell has said that her goal was just to recreate the feeling of reading this at 14. And so I went into it a little bit expecting it to have more of a sexy historical romance bodice ripper type feel. And it was at this point in the film that I thought, well, she's delivering on that. The scene immediately afterwards is also really fun because we see one of the housekeepers kneading some bread, and it's just kind of zoning in on her like slapping and kneading the bread and cutting back to Kathy's eyes. And I thought it was a really fun visual of Kathy being horny. And Kathy's just so overwhelmed and confused by this whole thing that she runs off to the moors to have a little bit of adult alone time, which immediately I was thinking to myself, really? Presumably virginal spinster age woman from the late 1700s introduced to the concept of being horny for the very first time. So she goes to the moors, just like out in the open, to jerk off. It just didn't really feel super realistic to me. And I thought to myself, wouldn't she be afraid of somebody walking up to her? And that's a valid fear because you know who does? Heathcliff. Heathcliff goes to find Kathy to try and talk all of this out, her marrying Edgar and also the weird moments that they had in the attic the night before. And he stumbles across her participating in this activity. And Jacob Elordi's a really great actor. I feel like he did really perfectly capture the tornness of like, ooh, I like what I'm hearing, but I shouldn't be listening to this and I should probably walk away, but I don't really want to walk away. And I also don't know how to walk away without making noise. And I don't want her to know I can hear her. And at this moment in time, I was sad, to be honest. And I was like, you know what? If what she's going for is steamy historical romance bodice ripper, I feel like we're capturing that. But this is the exact moment that it started to go downhill for me, and it was just a very, very slow spiral out from there. Because the problem number one that we get introduced to, the second that Heathcliff accidentally clatters some rocks and makes Kathy aware of the fact that he's there, so then they have to like confront not just this, but everything else going on between them, that means that we actually have to watch Kathy and Heathcliff stand in front of each other and speak to each other face to face. Which brings me to my first piece of criticism about this film, just as a film in isolation, not taking into account the source material, which is that somehow Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie, who are both phenomenal actors, who have both proven themselves in other films to be capable of having a lot of chemistry with other actors, had no chemistry with each other whatsoever. And the second they were actually face to face speaking to each other and had to interact with each other, it went from steamy to uncomfortable so fast. And I don't know what the problem was. I'm not an actor. I don't know what goes into having chemistry, having sexual tension with another actor. So I won't try to speak on why it didn't work, but I'm just telling you as the viewer, it did not work for me at all. And any scene they actually had together where they had to interact with each other face to face and speak to each other was more uncomfortable for me than it was steamy. And I just never believed them. When they were each in isolation, they could sink into their characters, but when they were together, they were actors on the screen to me, and I only saw Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi attempting to have a steamy scene together and not succeeding. Not to mention the fact that in this scene, Heathcliff picks Kathy up by her corset and then just holds her there by her corset laces, and they're just having a conversation and he's like holding her like this. And I immediately thought to myself, there's no way. And bear in mind, I knew that her goal was to capture some kind of 14-year-old fantasy. And so does this fit the 14-year-old fantasy vibe? Yes, absolutely. But is it realistic? No. So that kind of took me out of the scene too, because I remember thinking, this just isn't even hot to me at my big age. And maybe the problem is that I am at my big age. And I know that not only would that not be realistic for him, but that she would probably be really uncomfortable. If you've ever worn a corset before as an adult woman, the concept of, oh my God, this would not be comfortable. This would not be fun. And I just can't imagine that the two of them would actually be standing there able to have a conversation with each other. He would be so out of breath so quickly if he was even able to do this. And she would not be able to breathe at all. And maybe you're into that. I'm not saying you're not into that, okay? But she certainly would not be able to just be speaking to him because of the way the corset would be squeezing her in this situation. So the fact that they were doing this and they just had this whole conversation while he's holding her up by her laces ripped me right out of the viewing experience. And at first I thought that was the problem instead of Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie's chemistry, but then that continued even after the corset scene, so I do kind of know the problem was them. But I felt very validated by having this thought thought in the moment, because after I watched the film, I watched a few interviews with Emerald Fennell where she was talking about making it, and I found a clip of her talking about telling Jacob Elordi that she needed him to do this, and him immediately responding with, I can't do that. I can't just curl an adult woman. And Emerald Fennell went, well, you got a few months to train. You better figure it out. And so I guess he actually did do that when they did the wide shot. I thought they probably used a crane or something to lift her to get that shot. But according to Emerald Fennell, he actually did that to get the wide shot. So more power to you, Jacob Elordi. Don't expect this from your man, though. And that's not even an insult to him. But anyway, the conversation that they're actually having during all of this is Heathcliff trying to seduce Kathy a little bit and simultaneously express his love for her in a way, and her being like, no, stop it. I'm marrying Edgar and there's nothing to be done about this. I must marry him, Heathcliff, don't you understand? And then she runs off. And again, in the aftermath of this scene in isolation, I kind of thought that the reason it didn't work for me is just because I really didn't think it was realistic for somebody to just curl with one arm like an adult woman. And I did feel like this scene very much threw an ice bucket on the tension that we had built between Heathcliff and Kathy up to this point. But afterwards, Kathy expresses to Nellie her doubts about whether or not marrying Edgar is the right decision. And Nellie watches Heathcliff walk up and knows that he's listening, but doesn't say anything to Kathy. And Kathy makes a comment to Nellie about that she and Heathcliff would be destitute if they married, so she had to marry Edgar. And Heathcliff is very upset by this and runs off, so he doesn't hear Kathy confess her love for Heathcliff to Nellie. Heathcliff doesn't just run off and stop listening to the conversation that they're having, but he leaves Wuthering Heights entirely and disappears. And we get another time skip where Kathy and Edgar have been engaged this whole time, and Kathy has been trying to put off the wedding in a way, but eventually she marries Edgar, moves in with him and Isabella, and we get even more montage time skip of them living together and having a lot of fun together at Third Cross Grange, until eventually, according to a plot summary that I looked up after the fact to make sure that I had it all right, because I've only seen the film once, they said 5 years had passed. I didn't count through the montage, but it's such a specific number, I'm assuming they have a reason to say that's the amount of time that's passed. And eventually, Kathy becomes pregnant with Edgar's child. And this is when Heathcliff shows back up out of nowhere, and he's the same Heathcliff he was before, but now he has money. But unfortunately, Kathy and Edgar have been married for like years at this point, and she's pregnant with his child. So what's there to do? Guess her and Heathcliff still can't be together, right? Heathcliff buys Wuthering Heights from Mr. Earnshaw and then moves in with him and is living with him, and Mr. Earnshaw then dies. I will tell you, watching the film, that I very much got the vibe that Heathcliff killed Mr. Earnshaw, but in all that I've looked up about the film afterwards, I've seen nobody else saying that. Take that with a grain of salt. That's what I saw on screen. But there's a moment where Mr. Earnshaw is saying something to Heathcliff that would obviously really upset Heathcliff, and then the immediate next scene is Kathy finding out that her dad is dead and rushing to Wuthering Heights to see his dead body. I really do think that we're supposed to think that Heathcliff killed him, but everybody else is just saying he died of alcoholism. So do with that information what you will. And part of maybe why they think that is because this is when we get maybe the funniest piece of set dressing in this whole entire film, and it actually made me just burst out laughing in the theater. But you see Kathy run into the room where her dad's body is, and it's a close-up of her face, and then it cuts to the other angle so you can see her dad's body on the ground, and behind it are these two giant piles of label-less liquor bottles that are stacked in these like perfect triangles up into the corners of this room. If I can find a screenshot of it, I will show you guys. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to because the film is still so new. It's not out on streaming or anything. This shot cracked me up. Just the concept of an alcoholic finishing a bottle and like tossing it onto these piles and painstakingly maintaining these like perfect piles of their old liquor bottles, because that's the only way that they would stay in these nice piles. I'm not sure if that's the reaction they wanted, but that's the reaction that I had. I thought that was really ridiculous and very funny. But anyway, Kathy then kicks him because she hates him. And now Mr. Earnshaw's dead, and Heathcliff owns Wuthering Heights. Then we get a scene with Kathy and Isabella on a swing set. Well, Kathy's on the swing set. Isabella's pushing her, and Isabella tells Kathy that she's got the hots for Heathcliff, and Kathy makes fun of Isabella and tells her that Heathcliff would eat her alive, and it's very mean girl of her, and she's not supposed to come across well in this scene. And this scene is a little bit strange and off-putting, and I ended up feeling like this swing set was a little bit of an omen for how the rest rest of the film was going to be. It's a warning in a way. If you ever do watch it, the second you see the swing set, things are about to go very downhill very fast. So after this whole situation, Kathy embarrasses Isabella in front of Heathcliff by telling Heathcliff that Isabella has a crush on him. And again, it's very mean girl of her, and you're not really supposed to like her in this scene. But Heathcliff starts negging Kathy a little bit and telling her that maybe he will go after Isabella just to torture her. And then instead, Kathy and Heathcliff pick up a very steamy affair. Or it's supposed to be. It didn't really feel that way to me. Again, I feel like Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie really didn't have any chemistry in this film whatsoever, but we do get a montage of their two characters having sex after this, and it's just a solid 3-minute almost music video of the two of them boning in different scenarios. And Kathy has not told Heathcliff yet that she is pregnant. Eventually tries to call things off with Heathcliff because she knows about the baby, even if Heathcliff doesn't. And so this is her reasoning for not being able to leave Edgar. But Heathcliff won't hear it, and he keeps kind of talking her back into things. At some point during their affair, Heathcliff tells Kathy that he thought that she knew that he was listening when she was talking about marrying Edgar all those years ago because Nellie saw him walk up. So he would have assumed that Nellie would have warned her that Heathcliff could hear because Nellie would have known that. So once Kathy finds this out, she tries to dismiss Nellie, and instead Nellie goes to Edgar and tells him about Kathy and Heathcliff's affair. And then they have this moment where Heathcliff lures Kathy out of the house and they're kind of making out in the front yard, and Edgar fully knows that that's what they're doing out there. And so he goes out there and calls Kathy back into the house. And when he does, he mentions their son. So now Heathcliff knows that Kathy is pregnant. But never fear, because once her and Heathcliff are alone again, he is sure to tell her that he does not care and that he would be happy to raise another man's son if it means that he gets to be with her. But Kathy is still no, we can't be together, we can't be together, we can't be together. And they have a moment with each other where they're having sex, but Kathy is kind of negging Heathcliff in a way and is talking about Edgar. And Heathcliff's oh, is he really who you want to be with? Does he make you feel like this? That whole thing. And Kathy's yes, he does. He's great in bed. Even though we've kind of seen some scenes with her and Edgar in bed, so we know that's not true. And Heathcliff's oh yeah, well, I'll kill him. I'll kill him. And then she's wait, what? And she takes what he's saying ridiculously seriously and walks away from this genuinely believing that Heathcliff would kill Edgar, and this is what causes her to finally fully call things off between the two of them. And once again, I was just ripped out of the viewing experience, not only by their lack of chemistry, but just the fact that this is the most normal thing for a man to say ever, and the fact that she took him so seriously was really funny to me. I feel I'll complain about a coworker being kind of mean to me, and I'll have a man say I'll kill him. It's just, I don't know why she took him so seriously. But anyway, Heathcliff is sure to tell her that he'll never forgive her. And she's well, that's too bad. We just can't be together. So she's fully called things off with him, and she's back at Thrushcross Gate. Guys, I don't know why I can't say the name of this estate. I know I messed it up so many times in my original video. She goes back to where she lives with Edgar. Heathcliff decides to respond to this by breaking into Isabella's bedroom and having a very, very, very weird scene with her where he's I'm not a good person and I won't treat you well, and I'm in love with Kathy, and I'm only doing this to get back at her, and it's all about revenge, and I'll always be thinking about her when I'm having sex with you, and are you okay with that? And the whole entire time Isabella's just because she's just so horned up, she wants to have sex with him so badly that she just agrees to all of these things. In the aftermath of it, we see how Heathcliff tries to degrade Isabella and mistreat her, but she's just kind of into it, and they end up with their own ye old BDSM arrangement, and they end up co-conspirators in trying to torture Kathy and sending letters together back to Edgar and Kathy to try and torture both of them. But Nellie is burning all of these letters, so she's ensuring that Kathy never sees them. And eventually Nellie is the one who shows up instead of Kathy. And when she does, what she sees is Isabella chained up, barking like a dog. But when Nellie is really scandalized by this, Isabella gives her a little wink. to let her know that like she's into it, right? Admittedly, at the point of watching this film, I had not gotten to the part with Isabella and Heathcliff in my read of the book. So I genuinely watched this completely devoid of the context of it happening in the original book. And I can tell you that the emotion that I was experiencing watching these events play out on screen was sheer confusion. I was so confused. Not at what was happening. I understood what was happening on screen. I just didn't really understand why. And I had no idea how we had taken such a sharp left turn into this chain of events. It felt like the movie was playing out the way it was playing out. And then the swing set scene happens. And all of a sudden, Kathy and Heathcliff are having a montage of them boning all over the place. And then Heathcliff says he's going to kill Edgar. And Kathy takes this ridiculously seriously. And now Heathcliff and Isabella are like doing BDSM. And I'm just sat there like, how did we get here? What happened? And not only that, but I'm sorry. I don't know if this says something about me and what I read for fun, but you are not going to scandalize me with the implication of puppy play, okay? I was told that the Emerald Fennell experience was watching this sexual, but sexual in a grotesque way and in a scandalizing way sort of thing. And the opening of the entire film had shown me that. And I actually thought that that intro with the guy being hanged was way more scandalizing and sexual in that grotesque way than any of the BDSM stuff was, because you just never actually saw it. It was all just implied. And again, like maybe it says something about me, I don't know, but you're not going to freak me out with the concept of the idea that consenting adults out there do that. More power to you. If that's what does it for you and everybody's consenting, then be my guest. That's none of my business. But that's none of my business for a reason, because to be honest, I would not be that into that, and it would admittedly gross me out a little bit if I saw it. So if you actually want to make me feel that way, you have to show it to me. It felt like the film was afraid of itself. It felt like it was afraid to take things to the degree that it needed to be the scandalizing thing that it seemed like it wanted to be. It implied that he tied her up, and it implied that they did a little bit of stuff in front of some of the servants, and then it's implied that they did this puppy play, but we never actually see them do it. Like, if your goal is to make me uncomfortable and to shock me, you're gonna have to show it to me. But again, maybe that's just me. In the midst of all of this, Kathy has no idea that Heathcliff and Isabella have been writing letters back to them. Nellie has been burning all of them, and Nellie also doesn't tell her what she saw when she went there. And at some point in the midst of all of this, Kathy tells Nellie that the baby died, but then Nellie asked her if she bled, and she said no. So then Nellie says, well, then the baby didn't die. And Kathy says, if you say so. And then around this point in time, like after the puppy play scene, it's revealed that the baby actually did die when Kathy said, but she never had the actual miscarriage, and the fetus's body is still inside of her body. And so she got some kind of sepsis, like blood poisoning from this, and is dying. And she was really depressed about her and Heathcliff not being able to be together, and Edgar was really mad at her over the affair, so he was avoiding her, and Nellie did not tell Edgar how sick Kathy was, and this is very much framed out in the film to be Nellie's fault. In fact, Nellie is framed out to be kind of the villain of the story in a way. Yes, a lot of these are choices on Kathy and Heathcliff's part, but at every turn where there is a choice that separates them, it feels like there's a Nellie there to give them the plausible deniability of, well, if Nellie had told Kathy that Heathcliff could hear her, then she maybe wouldn't have said some of what she'd said. Or if Nellie had given the letters to Kathy, then she would have known that Isabella and Heathcliff weren't actually in love. You know what I mean? So there's this like deniability of, well, if Nellie hadn't acted that way, then maybe Kathy and Heathcliff would have made different choices. So maybe Nellie is the reason they couldn't be together. Maybe it's not really Kathy and Heathcliff's fault. So Nellie goes to tell Heathcliff that Kathy is dying, and there's a really cool fake out scene. I really liked the ending. Honestly, my favorite parts of this film were the very beginning and the very ending. I thought both were very good. It was everything in the middle that kind of lost me. Kathy hallucinates Heathcliff visiting her while she's dying and them having this grand goodbye, but it's a hallucination, and Heathcliff doesn't actually make it back to her before she dies. So by the time he walks into her bedroom, she is dead, and he instead cries over her dead body and says all the lines about haunt me, don't leave me in this world without you. And it is a testament to Jacob Elordi's skill as an actor that this scene choked me up and made me cry. And then we do get a flashback of young Kathy and young Heathcliff, where they're back in the moment together after Heathcliff has taken a beating for Kathy on her behalf. And there's a cute moment between them where Heathcliff tells her that he'll never leave her. And that's the end of the film. And my true, genuine emotion walking out of it was a sheer, simple, what the fuck was that? And not in like a good way. Not in like a, oh wow, I have to munch on that. Like, what did I just watch? I need to like think about this deeper. It kind of put me in the worst position a piece of media can put me in when it comes to making a video on it, because it didn't really give me anything to work with. Like, it wasn't terrible. It wasn't the worst movie I've ever seen to where I could sit here and talk endlessly about all the things that didn't work about it, but it didn't have that much that worked about it either. It was just super meh. Like, it entertained me. I was watching it the whole time, but some of that entertainment was coming from this incredulous feeling of some of what I was watching. And yeah, that was honestly like, I didn't have that much to say about it because there wasn't really that much for me to talk about. It was just kind of there. And if I wasn't making a video on it, and if I didn't go on to then read the rest of the book and understand the film within the context of the source material, I probably never would have thought about it ever again. And that really was how I felt, completely devoid of really any context. So then the question becomes, well, what was Emerald actually trying to do? Like, yes, we know this overarching kind of statement that it's about capturing the 14-year-old feel, but has she said anything else about it? And the answer is yes. Of course she has, because she was a writer-director doing press for a new film she had coming out. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about what Emerald herself has said about this film. And I found this really fascinating interview from the British Film Institute. I love this interviewer. What's her name? Do they tell us her name? But this interview starts out with the interviewer asking her what her goal was in making this, and when she knew she was going to make it, and when she made the decision to make this her next film, and all of that. And Emerald talks pretty openly about having read this book when she was a child and loved it, or more specifically, as she reveals later in the interview, really loved the first part of it with Cathy and Heathcliff, and that the rest of the book doesn't really call to her, and that she doesn't find it to be that interesting.
I think firstly I was quite scared because I really, really love the book, and I think anyone who loves the book, you know, it is kind of, it's insane to think you could adapt it because it's just so good and it's so rich and it's so complicated. I thought, well, I can't adapt the book as it is, but I can try and make an approximation of the way it made me feel when I was a teenager, and it made me feel, well, it made me feel. It made me cry, and it made me scared, and it made me troubled, and it made me aroused. I mean, it is a revenge book. I mean, the thing about the book is that it's sort of in two parts, and the second part is not about Cathy and Heathcliff, it's about their kind of descendants, and it's an acquired taste. You know, it's not the part that I always like loved and responded to. And so the kind of revenge part of it was always felt like the least interesting. I think both of these characters, all of these characters can be like reprehensible. They can all be kind of sort of jealous and cruel and spiteful and vain and, you know, all the things that they are. But they have to have, you know, you have to love them.
So she read it at 14 and she really loved Cathy and Heathcliff's story and seemingly started to visualize this film then. And this is just when it felt right to make it. But a lot of this stuff has maybe been in her mind since that age. And it's grown over the years as she's munched on it in her mind and let it marinate.
I always feel so mad when I talk about it, but I live in imaginary worlds. So I have a few parallel universes that I live in, and I guess lots of people do this, right? Yeah, it's sort of, they're kind of daydreams, but they're more real than daydreams, and they last for years. And so Saltburn was one, and Promising a Woman was one, and, you know, my book Monsters was one, and they all kind of live together. And Wuthering Heights has been one since I read it.
I completely understand what she means about having worlds in your mind with creative stuff. For me, that does happen with some of my bigger videos where I really will like munch on them for a while, and I almost feel like I have them in an area of my brain where they're just kind of marinating until they're ready for me to actually do something with them. Obviously, that's on a much smaller scale than what she creates. I'm not saying her and I are the same. I'm just saying I understand what she means when she says this. But it does explain a lot to me, because this movie really did feel very jumbled. And so knowing that some of this stuff maybe had been in her mind from very young, it's pure speculation on my part, but I wonder if it was a little bit hard for her to let go of some of the scenes that she wanted, even if they didn't really fit or they didn't make it feel seamless. Maybe this is a little bit of an evidence of like not being able to, not to be like super annoying, sorry, but like kill your darlings, as they say, at least in the literary world. And as we keep unpacking her approach to this film and whether or not it's valid to say she separated it from the source material and all of these things, I really do think this whole situation is an evidence of Emerald Fennell wanting to have her cake and eat it too. This seems like it was a very creatively cathartic thing for her to make, because it maybe was a lifelong dream of hers to make it and to make it in this way, and maybe she had these visuals in her head from that age. But just because that's true doesn't mean that she maybe should have made this film this way, and it also certainly doesn't mean that all of us have to like the film or be okay with it or say it's a good film. We'll unpack that further as we move, especially because she'll in one sentence say that she understands that this isn't the most faithful adaptation of the source material and that the book is so complicated that how could you ever put it all on screen? And of course she was going to have to make concessions and things like that. And then later in the same interview, she's asked about themes and she makes this joke.
What were the most important themes for you from the book that you really wanted to get across in the film?
So bad at themes. Because you never know. You have to make them up afterwards. And I'll tell you what I've made up for
Go
this.
on.
I think because really for me it's just, it comes from, as I've said, it sort of comes out sort of sometimes when you don't want it to. So I don't really know that if I can think thematically. But for me, certainly this film was about, what happens if you deny something kind of primal.
Now, I don't want to take a joke too seriously. I do think she's mostly kidding here. I would be very surprised if she actually did make this whole entire thing with zero thoughts on what the theme was whatsoever. And a lot of times as you make something, especially making something to this scale, things shift as you make it. So again, I don't want to take her joke too seriously. It's not the bit about, I kind of made up the theme afterwards that's interesting to me about this statement. It's actually this kind of like offhand comment she made about her not really being a very thematic thinker. I'll play it again.
So I don't really know that if I can think thematically, but...
And then also admitting that she really doesn't like the back half of this book, that she loves this book and she swears it's like one of her favorite books of all time, and she could talk about Emily Bronte and how genius she is for hours. It's like one of her favorite books and she always comes back to it and she always rereads it, but like not the second half of the book because who cares about that part? And it's like, does Emerald Fennell even really believe that she wasn't attempting to approach this film in a faithful way? Or is this really how she views this book? Like, to her, this book is the love story between Heathcliff and Cathy, and that what's genius about it are these beautiful lines that Emily Bronte wrote to represent this passionate and destructive love between the two of them. And that's the part of it that she thinks is genius, and she doesn't seemingly think anything of the rest of the book. Other than that, it's complex. But that's not the limit to Emily Bronte's genius. This book has stood the test of time for a reason. And it just ended up being so fascinating to me that she said this about not really being much of a thematic thinker, because she did end up with something that plot-wise mirrors the book a lot. And if you're familiar with the plot of the book, then a lot of what I described, with the exception of Cathy and Heathcliff actually having sex and having this affair, it does play out plot point wise very similar to the book, kind of exactly how you would imagine a movie adaptation of a book to do it, where they combined a few characters together and simplified a few things but otherwise followed the major story beats. And then so much of the dialogue is ripped, so the plot's there, the dialogue's there. So why is everybody saying this isn't a faithful adaptation of Wuthering Heights? Why is even Emerald Fennell saying it's not really a faithful adaptation of Wuthering Heights? Because the themes are missing. The context is missing. The reasoning behind why the characters are doing what they're doing at every turn, and why these events play out the way that they do, and how everybody feels about it, is missing. And you can't do that. And when I say you can't do that, I don't mean that it's illegal to do that. I mean, obviously she can make whatever movie she wants to make, but no wonder I was so confused. No wonder it felt like so many of these plot points came out of nowhere. And I actually do have proof that this was what was in my mind, because I vlogged the process of making my first Wuthering Heights video for my Patreon. And so I have a clip of me talking specifically about the Isabella and Heathcliff stuff in the immediate aftermath of having seen the film, having not gotten to that part of the book yet. But then the next part happened, and I thought, oh, if I could take any part out of this movie, I actually think it would be this part. Because not only do him and Isabella run off and get married, and I haven't technically read these pages in the book yet, so I guess for all I know, this is what happened, but I sincerely doubt it. So there I am sitting there saying, surely this doesn't happen. Surely that's not where it got, I guess I'll read it and I'll find out, but I really highly doubt that this is how all of this goes down. And in a way, I was right. Because that's not really what goes down between Isabella and Heathcliff, except it kind of is. Like in the book, Heathcliff does abuse Isabella, and there's a lot of mirroring of how Heathcliff treats Isabella, but in the book she's an abuse victim, and in the film she's a willing and consensual participant. And do you see how deeply that would change the feel of the events happening? We will unpack that a lot later in the video because wow, but this really carries us into what I just think is a fascinating conversation about what it means to adapt a source material, and whether or not you can give Emerald Fennell the defense in this instance of saying, well, I never claimed to be making a super faithful adaptation of Wuthering Heights, so people putting the pressure on the film for it to be a faithful adaptation is unfair. Because I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that in general. And I talked about it a little bit in my Frankenstein video, but I have more advanced thoughts on it now that I've had a few more months to think of it and another example of a director doing this. But I also think that especially in this instance with this adaptation and the way it ended up playing out on screen, I do not think that Emerald Fennell gets this defense at all. So let's have that conversation. Let's talk about if you can separate the adaptation from the source material. This has been the biggest topic of conversation with this film because fans of the book were very, very upset at the feel of the film and the fact that it isn't really Wuthering Heights, right? Again, you might be thinking, well, if the plot's there, if all the dialogue is there, if it's just kind of the feel of it's different, then why is everybody so upset? And why is everybody saying it's not a faithful adaptation? And even if they are saying that, then how is that fair criticism if Emerald Fennell has been open about the fact that that wasn't her goal at all? Was she really clear about that? Was she open about that at all? Like I said, this is a conversation that started on this channel with Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, where after seeing it, I said, hey, listen, that was a great film, but was it Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? Objectively, no. So should he have called it Frankenstein? And like I said, this was a little bit of a half-baked thought for me at the time, but now I feel like I can word so much better what I was trying to say in that moment, and it applies to this film as well. But in order to understand it, we have to talk about the concept of death of the author. Bear with me for a second. So many people out there misunderstand what death of the author is. It's a literary concept theory centering around the idea that an artist has no more ownership over the meaning of the art they create than the consumer of it. So if we're talking about a book, the idea being that the author could have tried to make the theme and the message something, but if a reader reads it and takes away something different, then that's equally as valid. And the author and other people talking about that don't get to say that that's invalid just because their interpretation is different from what the creator intended. Now, you might be thinking that I'm bringing this up to say that Emerald Fennell is trying to violate the concept of death of the author, and all the defenders of this film are as well, and that people going into it get to have their interpretations regardless of what Emerald Fennell intended. But that is what I mean when I say that there's so many people out there who fundamentally misunderstand the purpose of talking about death of the author when it comes to making art. Death of the author is not a rule that we all must abide by. It's a warning. It's a truth. You do not have control over what the viewer feels when they are watching your film. You put your art out into the world, and then the art speaks for itself. And what you say when you speak about the art means nothing. The art is the work. The art is the mouthpiece. The art is what people are consuming. And what we have here is a film that is called Wuthering Heights, and yes, there's quotes around the title. But first of all, I will say that I myself completely missed the quotes. I didn't realize the title was Wuthering Heights. I thought it was just Wuthering Heights, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. I found that out because I saw somebody else talking about the quotes. I don't think it's that obvious on the movie poster that the quotes are an integral part of the title. And not only that, but then a casual viewer would have to not only notice those quotation marks, but understand why they're there and jump to the thought of, oh, okay, this isn't going to be the most faithful adaptation of Wuthering Heights because it's not actually called Wuthering Heights. It's called Wuthering Heights. And I'm sorry, I just don't think that that is enough to do in the marketing to make it clear in the marketing of this film that it is not going to be the most faithful adaptation of Wuthering Heights, which is why I don't think Emerald Fennell gets that defense. Because if she wants it to be separate from Wuthering Heights, then she needs to separate it from Wuthering Heights. And that's what I meant about Guillermo del Toro titling his movie Frankenstein. I just didn't have the words to explain it at the time. If you call it Frankenstein, then people will go to the theater expecting Frankenstein. And when it isn't Frankenstein, they're allowed to walk away and say, I'm really confused. I was told that was going to be Frankenstein. Like, that's a valid reaction to that film. And just because Guillermo del Toro wasn't trying at all to do a faithful adaptation doesn't mean that he gets to escape that criticism. And the same is true for Emerald Fennell. She called the movie Wuthering Heights. If you didn't want the audience to walk in and expect it to be Wuthering Heights and to be judging it within the context of the source material, then you cannot present it with the context of the source material. And when I say cannot, like, again, she can do whatever she wants. At least at this point in time, it's still a free country and you can do whatever you want with your art. But you're not going to be successful with that. And you are going to have people going to the theater expecting to see Wuthering Heights and being disappointed when what they watch is not Wuthering Heights. And I don't think it's fair to say, well, she said it wasn't her goal to make it a super accurate adaptation, because if that were true, then she should have made sure that the art itself made that clear going in. And there is precedent for this, actually. The second that I thought of this, I thought about a musical called Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, which is a musical that's based off of a 70-page spread of War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. So that is an adaptation of a book where they really, really narrowed down the scope of what they were making. And I can't speak to how accurate it is to what happens in the book at all, but do you know why this isn't a topic of conversation about this musical at all, and why nobody would even care to figure out whether or not it's that accurate a representation of that 70-page spread from the book? Because it's not called War and Peace the Musical. And they never sold to any of the viewers that they were going to come into the audience and watch War and Peace the Musical. So they're making it really clear in the way they're presenting the art what people are going to come and view. It's not just in the presentation of the title, it's not just about the marketing materials. But remember what I said about the film loosely follows the plot of the book pretty well and adds the affair part, but otherwise more what's changed is the motivation behind why people do what they do and why everything happens, and each individual character's motivation behind their behavior, and what the overall message of the piece is. So not just in the marketing materials, but in the actual film itself, there's so much reference to the original work, all the way down to just straight up ripping most of the dialogue. Like, Emerald Fennell didn't really write that much dialogue for this film. She just used Emily Bronte's words. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. She's doing an adaptation, but that's my point. She made an adaptation. She made an adaptation of Wuthering Heights called Wuthering Heights, and then turned around and tried to say, but I'm not trying to make the most faithful adaptation, so nobody can watch it and say that it's not a faithful adaptation and be upset about that, because that's not what I was trying to do. I just did use the plot, the dialogue, and the title. And again, it's a free country. She can do whatever she wants. She can make the art she wants to make. That doesn't mean anybody has to like it. And I just don't think the defense of she wasn't trying to make a faithful adaptation is fair in this instance, because she doesn't get to just say that. The art itself has to speak for itself. And that's what I mean about Death of the Author being a warning. This film has had this effect on audiences in a foreseeable way. It would have been predictable prior to this film coming out that people would have reacted in this way, because it was essentially false advertising. And of course they did that false advertising because these books have built-in fan bases. Frankenstein has a fan base that would want to see a Frankenstein adaptation. Wuthering Heights has a fan base that would want to see a Wuthering Heights adaptation. There's a podcast called Good Noticings where during the film release, they were talking a lot about this film adaptation and their feelings on it. And they made a really, really, really good point about Emerald Fennell wanting to benefit off of this IP without wanting the responsibility of having to respect or honor the IP. And that's what I mean about wanting to have your cake and eat it too. Like, you don't get to have it both ways. You don't get to benefit from the marketing of the IP of a work, but then try to free yourself from the responsibility of being faithful to that work. Like, what these filmmakers are doing is pulling in an audience of people who love these books and want to see these books on screen. And that's why they're calling these movies these things, because there's a built-in audience for them of people who want to see it. And then they get upset when people turn around and are like, well, that wasn't the source material you told me it was going to be. There's a lot of people trying to defend her, saying, well, that wasn't what she was trying to do. But my point is, if that wasn't what she was trying to do, she needs to make that clear in the art itself. She can't just say that separate from the art and expect everybody to just know that. And again, when I use the word can't there, I don't say that it's like problematic of her to do this. I'm just saying that she's not going to be successful. She can't mind control everybody going to see the film to interpret it the way that she wants them to interpret it. She has to make them interpret it that way through the art itself. And that's what I mean about Death of the Author being a warning that you should heed if you're making art. You have no control over how people feel when they're watching it, so it behooves you to ensure that the message that you want is clear in the marketing and in how the film itself plays out. Now that I have made my argument for why it is fair for me to analyze it within the context of the source material, let's return back to the film and do that. I'm going to start with a smaller thing and build up to the two big things that everybody's been discussing. The small thing to me is just the flattening of the romance between Edgar and Kathy and Heathcliff to be from this complicated interwoven thing in the book to this man has money but I don't love him, and this man doesn't have money but I do love him. That is so cliche, because if you wandered into the historical romance section at your local used bookstore, specifically the mass market paperback one, make sure you're in that one, cover your eyes and blindly run your hands over the titles and then just grab one and pull it off the shelf. And I would give you about a 70% hit rate of having this romance be the plot of that book. The idea of a woman being in love with a man who doesn't have any money, but having the option of marrying a man who doesn't have money and being torn between these two choices. I genuinely could not think of a more cliche plot for a historical romance, and that's not how it plays out in the book. Kathy does love Edgar. I talked about this at length in part 1, so go watch me talk about it there if you're curious about it, but Kathy does love Edgar. Her love for him is just different than her love for Heathcliff. She has this very deep and passionate love with Heathcliff, but it's destructive in its passion, whereas her love with Edgar is much more safe and secure, and they build their relationship off of this stability and this reliability with each other, and she does love Edgar. She just doesn't love him as passionately as she loves Heathcliff, but with that passion comes that destruction. You see what I'm saying? And in the end of the story in the book, it is her inability to choose between these two boy toys that leads to her death. Like, I made this joke in part 1, but what happens is Edgar says to her, you have to choose. Either be with me and stop talking to Heathcliff, or leave me for Heathcliff. Stop having this weird love triangle with both of us. And it is the mere thought of choosing between her two boy toys that sends her into a brain fever that ends up taking her life. And as I said in part 1, more power to her. That's some queen shit. She really said, I will have both my boy toys or I will perish. And I respect that. But that being said, the story in the book is not cliche. It does not feel cliche. And it's really complex, and I don't think it would have been that difficult to rope that complexity into a film adaptation. But that's not what Emerald Fennell wanted to do, obviously. It's clear to me that when she read this book for the first time, she viewed Heathcliff as this ultimate sexy romance hero. and that she was not really into Edgar at all. And so, of course, when we're watching the events of the book play out through her interpretation of them, essentially, which is like the definition of an adaptation. It's like actually insane to me that people try and say this isn't an adaptation. So we're watching the events play out through her interpretation of how she feels when she's reading them. So Edgar becomes this really bland, really flat man that Kathy doesn't love at all, because that's how Emerald feels about him. But that's not how it plays out in the book. And so the book doesn't feel nearly as cliche as the film does. That also leads me to some thoughts I had about Heathcliff as a character. Obviously, there's a big thing she changed that we'll talk about in a second, but I also just felt like Heathcliff in the book is such a complicated character, because we watch him be so mistreated and so abused when he's a child, and you see that all play out, so you really feel for him, and you feel bad for him in that time, and you're rooting for him and Kathy, and you hate the people who abuse him. So when he goes off and he comes back just full of vengeance and abuses the people who abused him, you're a little bit like, hell yeah, man, more power to ya. But then that vengeful spirit stretches to him starting to abuse much more innocent characters in all of this who haven't done anything wrong, and all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, I'm not cool with this anymore. I was kind of cool with you treating your abuser the way you were treated. I'm not really cool with you abusing all of these innocent people as well, just to further the vengeance you're trying to get back at the people who hurt you. And that is what shifts him from this weird dark hero into a villain in a really interesting way. And throughout all of this is this deep love that he has for Kathy that is causing him to act this way, and this love that Kathy has back for him, and the fact that they can both admit that neither of them are very good people, and in a way that's what makes them great for each other, and they both acknowledge that, and they love each other through this villainy that both of them really have, because Kathy's not the best person herself in her own way, and that makes Heathcliff a fascinating character. But film Heathcliff gets just completely flattened and completely boiled down to the most bland, personality-less, cliche romance hero I've ever seen. Now, I've read so much romance in my time. Like, I know this character. I've read this character a million times. He exists in the story exclusively to love the main heroine. He has no personality outside of her and no purpose in the story outside of this blind, passionate love towards the heroine and a willingness to do anything for her. And that's all Heathcliff is in the film. And it's so frustrating to me because Jacob Elordi is the caliber of actor to perform Heathcliff to the complexity that he has, but Emerald Fennell did not direct him to do that. As far as we know, for all I know, that was Jacob Elordi's choice, but it really feels when you see Emerald Fennell talking about Heathcliff and her feelings about Heathcliff and her feelings about Jacob Elordi playing Heathcliff, that to her, this is Heathcliff. Heathcliff is just the bland, flat romance hero that exists in the story exclusively to love Kathy to a destructive degree. And that's all he is. Again, it's just so cliche. Like, she took a book and a story that was not a cliche and turned it into the most cliche historical romance period piece I've ever seen. In its quest to be unique from the original, it became so much less unique than the original is. And that's factoring out all of the really gross changes she made, which we're going to talk about now, starting with Heathcliff's race. Now, I'm going to get ahead of some comments that I've seen circulating around this conversation and remind you that I made a whole entire part 1 where I talked in depth about the book. And part of what I talked about is Heathcliff's race and how important it is to the story. I will spark notes it here, but if you want more context, I talk about it a lot more in that video. But the whole discourse about this film and the casting of Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff will lead you to believe, if you have not read this book, that there has been this long-standing debate over Heathcliff's race, and that there is this conversation about whether or not he is a darker-skinned individual, and that Emerald Fennell just chose to make him a white man, but that there's potential precedent for that. What would darker-skinned have meant to an English person in Europe at this point in time? And could he have been, for example, Italian? Because Italians were not very well loved and do have darker skin than English people. So maybe that's what Emily Bronte meant. And this is a long-standing discussion about Wuthering Heights, except no, it isn't. This discourse was made up for this film. Yes, there is conversation about Heathcliff's race, but it's not really discourse. If you're looking at the book in isolation, the conversation to be had is where exactly is Heathcliff from? And a lot of people do like to look at the historical context of the time and where he was found and whether or not Mr. Earnshaw was being honest about where he found him and what that could tell us about where he's actually from, since we don't know exactly. That's the discourse. There actually isn't that much debate as to what Heathcliff looks like, because we actually are painted a very clear picture of that through how he is described by the characters around him. It's not fun to read, and as a result, I will not be giving examples because for the most part, it's very racist statements, but that's part of the point of race actually being a very important aspect of this story, that if you read the parts where people are being racist to Heathcliff, the ways in which they're being racist to him and the things that they are saying does paint a very vivid picture of what Heathcliff actually looks like. He's described using slurs for Romani. He's described using slurs for generally South Asian. Somebody at some point speculates that he could have been a castaway from the Americas. And when you look at people from these three populations, there is a central look there. And not only that, but there's a lot of comments about Heathcliff's eyes throughout the book, and a lot of the people being racist to him talk about his eyes, and they're like, look at those eyes, the devil's eyes, right? Like I said, it's not fun to say out loud, but to me, that really supports the fact that he was probably South Asian. And again, there is conversation about exactly where he could have been from or what his race or nationality exactly is. But all of that conversation centers around understanding that this was what he looked like and trying to look at the historical context of the time and figure out whether or not Emily Bronte herself knew what Heathcliff's nationality was, and if so, can we figure it out given where he was found and the historical context of the time? Like, that is the conversation about Heathcliff's race in the literary world when you discuss Wuthering Heights. There was zero conversation about whether or not he was one of the less desirable European nationalities at that point in time. Like, that was a discourse that was made up for this film. Jacob Elordi does not look how Emily Bronte describes Heathcliff in the book, and this is an objective fact. This is not up for debate. Do not let anybody out there convince you that this is up for debate. It's not. He's not Italian. We know that for sure. So if that's the case, then why didn't Emerald Fennell cast him this way? And is it ethical or not of her to have done that? All of this will just be pure speculation, because anytime she's asked about this, she gives a really canned PR answer that just kind of centers around this is what her vision was and this is what she wanted to create. But my speculation had been that it was potentially because, like I said, what she ended up doing with the Edgar Heathcliff plotline ended up being very cliche. And so that story is told all the time. Even though classism and poverty is a very serious conversation, there are campy, fun, silly, bodice ripper historical romances written with this plot line. There is precedent for that. But you know what there isn't really precedent for? The idea of a campy, fun, silly romance that has that sort of feel, but it's because of the race of the characters as opposed to just because of their financial situation. You could find a million historical romances about a woman caught between a man who doesn't have money and a man who does. You're not really gonna find very many campy, fun, bodice-ripping, sexy historical romances about a white woman and a black man in the 1930s South. And there's a reason for that, because that would be disgusting and tasteless. And that icky feeling that you got from me even saying that out loud is exactly why those stories don't really exist, because that is a very, 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 very serious topic. And racism is still something that is prevalent in our world to this very day, and people suffer as a result daily. And so taking a lighthearted approach to that type of conversation is just not a good idea. It's not appropriate, and it shouldn't be done. And so my speculation was that Emerald Fennell knew this, and she knew that she wanted the film to have a campier, lighter feel. And so she not just took the racism conversation out of it, but cast a white man to ensure that people going in expected there to be no conversation about race. Also somewhat showing that she understands that the art needs to speak for itself, and some people might be expecting a race conversation, so if she cast a biblically accurate Heathcliff, that some people might read that race conversation in there even if she didn't intend it, and she was trying to avoid that. But after watching her British Institute interview, I actually think the answer is infinitely simpler than that. I'm gonna play you this clip.
The thing is with him, as I saw him, he came out of hair and makeup in his Felix 2005 sideburns and the like tousled hair, and he looked exactly like the Heathcliff on my sort of like 90s paperback.
I'm actually at this point in time thinking it might genuinely be as simple as Jacob Elordi looks like the man that was on the cover of her 90s paperback. And so that's how she pictured Heathcliff, because that's what the guy on the cover looked like. And she's had these visuals since she was a child. So that's what she wanted to put on screen. But neither of those things make it a good choice. Yes, ultimately she's the artist and she can make the choice she wants to make, but we don't have to like it. We don't have to agree with it. Just because she had a vision and executed it doesn't mean all of us need to give the film 5 stars. Like, you are still allowed to disagree with the artistic choices she chose to make, even if she executed them. And I disagree with this artistic choice. I don't think this can be done with this story. And I could sit here and make an in-depth argument as to why, but sometimes satire makes a point infinitely better than you ever could just by making the arguments. And I saw a TikTok from a creator that so perfectly captures exactly why this is so tasteless and so out of touch and just should not have been done with this story. So I'm just gonna play that for you.
Well, I wanted to make To Kill a Mockingbird, but the racism part of it was really heavy, so I just avoided it. Crime and Punishment is one of my favorite novels, but the punishment part really is too complex to put into one script, so I focused on just the crime. Well, Judas is such an irredeemable character in the Bible. For the purposes of cinema, I don't think someone irredeemable is all that interesting, so yeah, that is why we cut Judas out. And with anything, people are going to have strong opinions because Fahrenheit 451 is such a beloved book, but I really thought there was something to be explored in how these two people love each other and the sex that they have. And so the book burning part of it, I just sort of put to the side as more of an aesthetic background piece. Invisible Man is really so up to interpretation. I think that people might have one version of how they see the character in that book, but the way that I saw the character may be different than how others saw the character in Invisible Man. And I think that's my prerogative to sort of cast the version that I think is in my mind.
And I really have nothing more to say on it than that. Can you take the racism element out of To Kill a Mockingbird? Can you take the book burning element out of Fahrenheit 451? Like, again, I talked about this so much in part 1. So if you want more conversation around that, definitely go watch that. But you cannot devoid the story of the context of Heathcliff's race. Because yes, on the surface, why he and Cathy can't be together is because Hindley hates Heathcliff and is actively keeping them apart and is really mistreating Heathcliff. And if that name confuses you because you haven't read the book, Hindley is Cathy's brother in the book, and in the film they combined Mr. Earnshaw, Cathy's dad, and Hindley into one character and kind of had the one character serve both purposes. That sort of change I'm totally fine with. That stuff happens in book to movie adaptations all the time. But anyway, Hindley hates Heathcliff. Hindley is the one actively keeping Cathy and Heathcliff apart. So the question becomes, why does Hindley hate Heathcliff? It's because he's racist. Hindley does not like Heathcliff because of his race. And he's racist to Heathcliff all the time. I made a comment towards the end of part 1 where I said that the book had such modern feeling commentary about racism, and it ended up being one of my favorite aspects of the book. You cannot strip the conversation of race out of this book. Again, she can do whatever she wants. She can make the art that she wants. Like, if she wants to take the racism conversation out of it, she can, and she did, and nobody's gonna arrest her. I don't think she ever would have been successful doing that. I think that she tried to avoid having a race conversation in the film. When race is an integral part of a source material, you don't erase a conversation about race by removing it from the adaptation. You just create a conversation about why the racial element was removed from the adaptation, and that's what happened here. Emerald Fennell didn't get to avoid this conversation just because she didn't want to touch it and she didn't want to cover it because it was too dark and she didn't feel like it fit the theme and the vibe she was going for. Emerald Fennell doesn't get to just avoid a conversation about race because she didn't want to have it, even though the source material had that conversation. Because now the conversation is about why she didn't include the racial element. Like, she just was never going to be successful doing that because of how integral a part of this book that is. So that's the stuff about Heathcliff's race. The other major change that she made that people were pretty upset about is what she did to Isabella's character. Because in the book, a lot lot of the events play out in the same way, but Heathcliff abuses Isabella. And so a lot of people have talked about how gross it is that Emerald Fennell took a character that is a victim of abuse in the source material and turned her into a willing participant of the same abuse in the film. Heathcliff beats and rapes Isabella in the book. And so if you take that and you turn that into a consensual sadomasochistic relationship between the two of them in the film, I just cannot wrap my brain around why she ever thought that would land with anybody. It's so disgusting. And I almost have difficulty talking about it because it elicits such an emotional response in me. And so I'm going to try and put my feelings into words, but understand that this is a very personal topic for a lot of women out there. As if the act of doing it is not grotesque enough, her defense of it is abhorrent. I found a quote from Entertainment Weekly. I'm not sure if she gave it directly to them or if they were pulling it from somewhere else, but I'll link the article. They claim that she said that the reason is because, hang on, let me just read it directly. So specifically, she's talking about the puppy play scene from the movie where Isabella is chained up like a dog barking and Nellie walks into this and talks to Heathcliff. That scene in the book, I think that's the reason why Wuthering Heights was eviscerated when it came out, because I think it was just so shocking to people, Fennell explains, because there's so much in what happens there that is very, very complicated, very transgressive. Even for now, it's shocking. And obviously, I visually added some things to that scene, but it is almost all Bronte. So in her own words, according to Entertainment Weekly, this is Bronte who wrote this, not her. And she just added something visually, the visual addition to the scene being Isabella being chained up there as a dog. So let's talk about this scene from the book. Let's talk about where this dialogue comes from. So in this scene in the book, Nellie has gone to visit Wuthering Heights, where Isabella is now living, because Isabella has written to Nellie to ask her to come help her because she's being horrifically abused by Heathcliff. I'm going to read a lot of quote here. Not all of this made the scene in the film. Just bear with me here. Can I trust your assertion, Isabella? Are you sure you hate me? If I let you alone for half a day, won't you come sighing and wheedling to me again? I dare say she would. Rather I had seemed all tenderness before you. It wounds her vanity to have the truth exposed. But I don't care who knows that the passion was wholly on one side, and I never told her a lie about it. She cannot accuse me of showing a bit of deceitful softness. The first thing she saw me do on coming out of the Grange was to hang up her little dog, and when she pleaded for it, the first words I uttered were a wish that I had the hanging of every being belonging to her except one. Possibly she took that exception for herself, but no brutality disgusted her. I suppose she has an innate admiration of it, if only her precious person were secure from injury. Now, was it not the depth of absurdity, of genuine idiocy for that pitiful, slavish, mean-minded bratch, which is a female dog, which we would now use the word bitch to describe, so essentially calls her a bitch, to dream that I could love her? Tell your master, Nellie, that I never in all my life met with such an abject thing as she is. She even disgraces the name of Linton, and I've sometimes relented from pure lack of invention in my experiments on what she could endure, and still creep shamefully cringing back. But tell him also to set his fraternal and magisterial heart at ease, that I keep strictly within the limits of the law. I have avoided up to this period giving her the slightest right to claim a separation, and what's more, she'd thank nobody for dividing us. If she desired to go, she might. The nuisance of her presence outweighs the gratification to be derived from tormenting her. So that's what Emerald Fennell says is Bronte's words that she used for the scene, and she just visually added Isabella chained up like a dog barking and then winking at Nellie to make sure that not just Nellie but everybody knows, including the viewer, that she's actually a willing participant in this. Heathcliff humiliating her and saying, well, no matter how I mistreat her, she comes crawling back to me. She hasn't left me yet, so she must like how I'm treating her, which is not just accurate to how an abuser would feel about their victim, and is in and of itself commentary on people who frown upon domestic abuse victims by kind of throwing at them this why didn't you leave conversation, but it's meant to show the depth of the depravity that Heathcliff has fallen to. And this is the final nail in the coffin in the book of him becoming just the full-on villain of the story and you having no pity for him anymore and no understanding and patience left for what he went through as a child that turned him into this. So Emerald Fennell read that and thought to herself, what if that's true? And what if this is like BDSM? And what if Isabella actually is into it and he's not actually mistreating her, but she actually is consenting to some degradation from his part? And again, yes, that's her artistic vision. That's her interpretation of this scene. That's her showing us this scene on screen through her lens, but I think it's fair to say her lens is despicable in this case. And I think that if you read this and you think to themselves, oh, what an interesting spin I could make on this, what an interesting angle to take of what if she actually was into it, like how does your brain even jump there? And if I had read the book first and like gotten to this part first, and you had said to me, Meredith, what's the worst way Emerald Fennell could have adapted this to the screen? I genuinely don't think that my brain ever could have even arrived at what if she makes Isabella like the abuse. And not only that, but in the immediate paragraph after that, we see how her argument that these are Bronte's words falls apart at the seams. Allow me to continue reading. Nellie responds to this by saying, Mr. Heathcliff, said I, this is the talk of a madman, and your wife, most likely, is convinced you are mad, and for that reason, she has borne with you hitherto. So she's saying, you sound insane, and it's probably because you are insane, and she's afraid of you, that she has not left. But now that you say she may go, she'll doubtless avail herself of the permission. You are not so bewitched, ma'am, are you, as to remain with him of your own accord? Take care, Ellen, answered Isabella, her eyes sparkling irefully. There was no misdoubting by their expression the full success of her partner's endeavors to make himself detested. Don't put faith in a single word he speaks. He's a lying fiend, a monster, and not a human being. I've been told I might leave him before, and I've made the attempt, but I dare not repeat it. Only, Ellen, promise you'll not mention a syllable of his infamous conversation to my brother or Catherine. Whatever he may pretend, he wishes to provoke Edgar to desperation. He says he has married me on purpose to obtain power over him, and he shan't obtain it. I'll die first. I just hope, I pray that he may forget his diabolical prudence and kill me. The single pleasure I can imagine is to die or to see him dead. So genuinely, in like just the I'll just hold this. Pause it if you want to read it. Yes, there's this whole passage right here where Heathcliff is saying, I actually think she's kind of into it because she hasn't left me yet. And then Nellie says, well, now that you've said that she's free to leave, Isabella, do you want to leave with me? And Isabella's like, he's lying, Nellie. I tried to leave and he wouldn't let me. That her only hope is that he will slip up and kill her because her only pleasure is to die or to see him dead. So methinks it's actually not Emily Bronte's words that she potentially was enjoying it or liked it. Methinks that was 14-year-old Emerald Fennell's justification for Heathcliff's behavior in this, because she could not view him as the dashing, sexy romance hero that she was picturing him as at the time, if what was actually happening here is what's true about this scene. I think that this actually fits Emerald Fennell's vision for her film the most, of like a 14-year-old's understanding of what's happening here, because I would not expect a child to understand that about what Heathcliff is saying. If a child were reading this book and they viewed Heathcliff as the sexy romance hero because of all of these romantic lines that he says about Kathy, and they were sitting in front of me making the argument of, but what if he and Isabella are kind of like in cahoots together? Because remember, it's from Nellie's perspective, so what if they're lying? What if he isn't really that evil? What if it's all just to get back at Kathy and she's actually into it or a willing participant? I would certainly sit and attempt to explain to that 14-year-old why that isn't my interpretation of the scene. But if she wasn't really grasping it, I would just shrug and say she's young, she'll get older, and it'll click for her eventually. Unfortunately, how disgusting Heathcliff is in this book. Emerald Fennell is not a 14-year-old girl. Emerald Fennell is 40. I expect a 40-year-old woman to read this scene and see it for what it is in a way that I wouldn't expect a 14-year-old to. And it just brings me back to, I understand that she had this vision for this film she wanted to make potentially back that far, and when she was that young, and when this maybe was her understanding of this book. And I understand that that was the film she wanted to make, and I understand that it was potentially very creatively fulfilling for her to make that film, and that she didn't want to make concessions to her childhood vision, regardless of if the source material backs up what her original interpretation was. But that doesn't mean that we can't be critical of that. Just because all of that's true doesn't mean I have to like the film or say it was a good idea to make it. And I personally think that some of these changes are really, really gross. And it's especially gross to see her in this British Institute interview talk about Margot Robbie being a girl's girl and women supporting women, and her being the filmmaker behind Promising Young Woman, and having this very like feminist persona and energy that she wants to have out there, only to show us through her lens how she actually views domestic abuse. And it's not even just about misunderstanding it yourself, but putting on screen the most classic invalidation of the concept of victims of domestic abuse being victims. Like, there are people in this world who genuinely believe that you cannot really be a victim of domestic abuse because you could always just leave that partner and get support from the police and community to leave them if they're mistreating you. And there are people who believe this. And there are a lot of domestic abuse victims out there who suffer with a lot of guilt in the aftermath of what happens to them and while it's happening to them, because they do not understand why they did not leave. And it's because of the emotional manipulation aspect of it. It's not that I think that she thinks that of all domestic abuse victims, but I do think that she was willing to show a domestic abuse victim as a willing and consensual participant to their own abuse, and has said it's because of a line in the book where the abuser speculates that maybe she's a willing participant in the abuse, and her willingness to do that shows to me that she has zero respect for domestic abuse victims. That's the point I'm making. I just almost don't even know how to like transition from that into a conclusion, but I really do think that this entire film was very ill-advised. And I understand that it was potentially very creatively cathartic of her to make, and that she had a vision and she executed that vision, and this is what she interprets when she reads the original Wuthering Heights, and so that's what she wanted to put on screen, and so she did that. But that doesn't mean that any of us have to like it or think that it was a good idea, and we all are allowed to be critical of these choices within the context of the source material. Sorry to leave this one on such a dark note, you guys. That's why I kind of saved this for the end. And my advice just for any creatives out there would just be that if you want to adapt something and you want to make some major changes to it, you need to ensure that the art speaks for itself with those changes, and you need to understand that if you market it as an adaptation with the title and the way it's presented and what happens on screen and all of that, then people will interpret it as an adaptation, and then they will judge it within the context of the source material. And that brings us back to that concept of death of the author being a warning. In my opinion, this film was a mistake, and it was a mistake that was avoidable and foreseeable. I think that anybody along the creative process could have taken a step back, looked at this, and said, wait, I don't actually think this is the best idea. I don't think we should be doing this. And none of them did. And so I think it's worth criticism. I think it's worth criticizing Emerald Fennell for her writing and directing of it. I think it's worth criticizing Margot Robbie and her company for producing it, and everybody else involved with it. Like, it is fair to criticize all of the creatives involved with bringing this project to fruition, because I don't think it should have been made in this manner. And I think at any point, any of them could have stopped, taken a step back, look at what they were doing, and said, actually, from a bird's eye view, I'm not sure this is the best idea. I feel like this isn't gonna land. And that's gonna be all for me today, you guys. What a wild ride, what a journey all of this was. Have you seen this film? Have you read the book? What did you think about all of it? Do me a favor, and if you haven't read the book, don't tell me I'm wrong about the book, but I'm sure people are gonna ignore that. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!